All I wanted that morning was a peaceful cup of coffee on my porch. Instead, I got Miranda Blackwood in a navy blazer and heels, marching up the steps like she owned the place, clutching the crimson paper like it was a holy decree. "You have 48 hours to vacate," she barked. "Vacate my grandfather's lake cabin, the one I inherited fair and square." According to the shiny new HOA, it was an official eviction notice. To me, it was a shot fired. Behind her salon-styled curls and polished persona was a plot deeper than I could have guessed. Bogus citations, rigged inspections, outright sabotage. This wasn't just about keeping my home, it was about unraveling a buried truth about who really held the power over this lake. Ever squared off with an HOA dictator like Miranda? Tell me your story in the comments. I get the feeling I'm not alone in this nightmare. The morning had started like any other out here. I'd been living at this lakeside retreat for 3 quiet years since inheriting it from my grandfather, running freelance archaeological surveys from my home office. The cabin itself wasn't much built in '87, with cedar siding faded by time and a porch that creaked in all the familiar ways, but it was mine. More importantly, it was peaceful. That peace ended when Miranda arrived 2 years ago and swiftly crowned herself queen of the neighborhood. She now stood on my porch, dressed like a corporate executive, her blonde curls flawless, makeup untouched by the summer heat. Everything about her radiated control, her manicured hands, her tailored jacket, even the posture of someone used to getting her way. "This property," she declared, brandishing the paper like a judge's gavel, "violates Lakeside Estates' HOA regulations." She rattled off a list of so-called infractions, architectural flaws, missing permits, and the unforgivable crime of being an eyesore that supposedly dragged down property values. The accusations struck like slaps, my breath shortened. A creeping chill spread through me, the same one I felt as a kid watching our family land be taken due to a paperwork loophole. My hands trembled, and I had to put my mug down before I dropped. The ceramic tapped against the porch railing, chipped, and a small shard fell like a splinter of my collapsing world. "Ma'am," I finally managed, voice ragged, "I have all the proper paperwork. My grandfather left this place to me. Legally." The words were weak, too quiet even for my own ears. Miranda let out a tight, cruel laugh. "Sweetheart, outdated documents don't override current regulations. Lakeside Estates HOA has governed this area for over a year now. Your little shack either gets a full overhaul or it's coming down. You've got 48 hours to comply or we file suit." She thrust the red slip toward me like it was an execution order. My fingers could barely close around it as a rush of helplessness washed over me. The frightened kid I used to be resurfaced. Before I could retreat into my cabin and disappear from her gaze, a voice rang out from across the yard. "Morning, Miss Miranda. Lovely weather for intimidation, isn't it?" We both turned. Eugene Gable, my 72-year-old neighbor, stood on his porch, camera in hand. He'd been quietly documenting neighborhood drama ever since an earlier HOA scheme nearly robbed him of his own home. Eugene believed in one thing: evidence. He'd said once that a good recording was the best way to stop a bully. Miranda's polished expression twitched with annoyance. "You can't film me without consent, old man," she spat. Eugene didn't flinch. "Actually, ma'am, you're trespassing and issuing legal threats. Pretty sure this qualifies as a public interest matter." Miranda's eyes sharpened, sizing us up like chess pieces mid-game. She glanced between us, calculating, weighing next moves. "This isn't over, Langston," she muttered darkly. 48 hours, tick-tock. With that, she spun on her heel and strode away, heels clicking like gunshots on pavement. I stood frozen, notice in hand, coffee forgotten, and hands still unsteady. Eugene ambled over, camera slung casually at his side. "Son," he said low, "she's been plotting something since the day she showed up." You're gonna need allies. And a hell of a lot of evidence. The rest of that day unraveled in a blur of panic and phone calls. I tried to lose myself in work. I had a geotechnical report due for a site across the county. But every time I looked at that red slip sitting on the kitchen table, my focus shattered. The notice was packed with legal jargon that read like, another language, architectural conformity, mandatory code compliance, remediation clause. I couldn't stop pacing, wearing a trench into my floorboards, fueled by enough caffeine to launch a drone. That once peaceful cabin had become the battlefield, and Miranda had fired the first shot. By sundown, I had accomplished exactly nothing, unless you count confirming that I was still the same scared kid I'd been at 12. The lake glowed in golden hues as the sun dipped behind the trees, the kind of view that usually calmed me. But not that evening. All I could see was that red notice and the ticking, 48-hour countdown that now felt like a bomb wired to my front door. I sat quietly on the porch, watching the waves kiss the shoreline, wondering if this was how it all ended, not with a fight, but with me giving up. Letting go of the cabin felt like erasing everything my grandfather had built. But the idea of going head-to-head with Miranda and her army of paperwork felt utterly out of reach. That's when Rick Palmer's truck cruised past. He slowed as he approached my driveway. We'd only ever traded small talk at block parties. Tonight, though, he hesitated, window rolled halfway down, looking like he was torn between driving on and saying something that mattered. The next morning, Eugene showed up before I'd even taken a full sip of coffee. He carried a thick manila folder that looked like it had the weight of a courtroom trial inside. "Sawyer, my boy," he said, settling into a porch chair like he'd been rehearsing this conversation for weeks. "We need to talk about our mutual Miranda problem. What I've found will turn this whole mess on its head." Turns out Eugene's quiet watchfulness hadn't been idle nosiness, it was driven by scars of his own. 3 years ago, a different HOA board tried to force him to tear down the garden he built for his late wife. "I've had eyes on Miranda since the day she unpacked her boxes," he said gravely. She hadn't just moved in, she had targeted this area deliberately, hunting for legal weak spots. Older homes, fuzzy property lines, aging owners. My grandfather's cabin was at the top of her list because the county files made it look vulnerable. Eugene's documents showed a disturbing pattern. This was less about regulations and more about strategic pressure aimed at acquiring lakefront properties without having to pay market value. Eugene had dug deep using FOIA requests, local property maps, even drone footage. What he uncovered painted Miranda not as a concerned neighbor, but as a methodical opportunist. She'd spent months before moving and collecting information on nearby homes, even bringing in contractors to quietly assess structural issues on surrounding properties. "This isn't beautification," Eugene said, his voice hardening. "This is a hostile takeover wrapped in paperwork. And you're the first domino." When he left to continue gathering more intel, I called Tom Stevens, the local attorney I'd spoken to once before about boundary rights. At first, Tom was skeptical until I walked him through Eugene's findings. His tone shifted. "Sawyer," he said, "if what you're telling me checks out, she's not just harassing you, she's orchestrating a fraudulent property grab, abusing HOA influence as cover." Tom laid it out. "Legally, my cabin predates the HOA's existence by decades, which gives me leverage. But Miranda wasn't relying solely on HOA rules. She had been filing complaints with every agency she could think of. Environmental violations, permit issues, zoning problems. It was a tangle of red tape designed to bury me under legal fees." "It's a strategy of attrition," Tom said. "She's betting you'll fold under pressure rather than fight back." He mapped out potential defenses but warned that we were up against someone with deep pockets and a long-term plan. We were still talking when my phone rang. "Miranda." Tom told me to answer it on speaker so he could listen. Her voice was sugary, calculated. "Mr. Langston," she began sweetly, "I just got out of a meeting with the county planning department. Regarding your property, given the urgency, they've agreed to fast-track the compliance review. Expect more documentation shortly. I wanted to keep you informed." She hung up before I could say a word. There was a silence. Then Tom spoke. "That was a major slip. She just admitted to backdoor meetings with officials before any process officially began. That suggests undue influence, at best possibly corruption. And that we can use." Less than 2 hours after her call, my property looked like a crime scene. 4 official vehicles pulled into my drive in convoy formation. Out stepped a county building inspector, an environmental officer, and a code compliance team. They each carried documents citing urgent violations, and all had a vague, apologetic air about them. Rodriguez, the lead inspector, explained that they were obligated to investigate every complaint, even ones that felt exaggerated. The process devoured my entire day. I lost 2 full workdays' pay, and despite combing through every inch of the property, they found nothing. My cabin passed every inspection. Still, they had to file reports, schedule follow-ups, and essentially stay on my case until the multiple complaints were addressed. Miranda, meanwhile, stood on her freshly manicured lawn, arms crossed, watching with smug satisfaction. She didn't need any actual violations. The real weapon was the process itself: expensive, exhausting, demoralizing. I sat on my porch that night, trying to untangle everything Eugene had shown me, what Tom had said, and the hours I'd lost to empty inspections. That's when my phone buzzed with a new message. Unknown number. "This is Rick Palmer from Maple Street. I need to talk to you about your grandfather and what Miranda's really planning for this neighborhood. There are things you don't know, things you need to hear. Can we meet tomorrow morning?" I stared at the message, debating whether this was another trap or a possible ally. His timing, right after the inspection chaos, made it clear he was paying close attention. I replied, "Yes, 8:00 a.m. I stayed home and tried to brace myself for whatever Rick Palmer was about to reveal. He showed up at exactly 8 a.m., looking like a man who hadn't slept well, and not because of insomnia, but guilt. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, with the kind of open, earnest face that naturally invited trust. But after what Miranda had put me through, I'd stopped trusting anyone on sight. Rick's eyes kept drifting toward Miranda's house as he walked up, like he was measuring the risk of even talking to me. "Before we start," he said, settling into a porch chair with clear hesitation, "I want you to know I never really supported Miranda's complaint. When she brought around that petition, she made it sound like it was just about setting some basic standards. I signed it because it seemed harmless. But after seeing what she's really doing, I want to help." He pulled out a worn notebook, filled with neatly written notes, the kind of thing you don't put together overnight. "The thing is," he continued, "I knew your grandfather, Harold Langston. He taught a community college history class that I took 6 years ago, back when I'd just moved here. That stopped me cold. I hadn't known my grandfather kept teaching after retirement, much less that one of his former students still lived just a few blocks away." Rick's tone softened as he talked about how my grandfather made local history come alive, how he used stories and maps to explain how the lake and surrounding land had developed over the last century. "He mentioned your property often," Rick said, flipping through his notebook. "Not to brag, just to illustrate how land use evolved in the area. He said the original boundaries were very different than what people assumed. A lot of newer developments didn't factor in the historical records." Rick looked up from the page and met my eyes. He said if anyone ever tried to challenge your family's ownership, the truth would be in the old documentation, not in whatever people thought they knew. Before I could ask more, the quiet morning was obliterated by the scream of industrial landscaping gear. I looked across at Miranda's property. A crew had rolled out what looked like enough equipment. to clear a state park. Chainsaws, wood chippers, a stump grinder loud enough to rattle teeth. Rick and I had to shout just to be heard. "She started this yesterday 6 o'clock sharp," Rick yelled over the noise. Every day this week, same thing. The so-called landscaping wasn't about yard maintenance. It was psychological warfare. Over the next several days, Miranda launched a full-on campaign designed to wear me down. That night, massive floodlights appeared along her property, line-angled perfectly to beam directly into every window of my cabin. Sleep became a thing of the past. The combined assault of blaring machinery at dawn and blinding light at midnight turned my home into a prison of exhaustion. But she didn't stop there. The worst came when she found a way to go after my livelihood. I was halfway through an archaeological survey project near the county line, a steady job, one that helped me stay afloat financially. Then the developers called to say they were terminating the contract. They'd received anonymous complaints, serious ones. Accusations that questioned my qualifications, ethics, and even hinted at legal issues. Someone had contacted the state archaeological board, the county, and my insurance carrier. It took 3 grueling days to clear my name, but by then, the damage was done. The company had moved on. Miranda had found a way to sabotage me without ever touching a thing. That was the breaking point. I decided to confront her, thinking naively that maybe there was still a sliver of humanity I could reach. I walked to her house just after 7 o'clock p.m. She answered in cocktail attire, looking like she was headed to a dinner party. Well, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "If it isn't the neighborhood's most notorious code violator. What can I do for you, Mr. Langston?" I tried to stay calm. "Miranda," I said, "I think we need to talk. Maybe there's a way to resolve this without making life hell for everyone." For a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Weariness? Pain? Then her voice changed. "You want the truth, Sawyer?" she asked, her tone quiet. "After my divorce, I spent 6 months living out of my car. My ex took everything. He used the law to destroy me. I promised myself I'd never be blindsided again. Not in my home, not in my community." For a second, I almost felt sorry for her, but then her armor clicked back into place. "That doesn't mean I'm going to let your little cabin ruin everything I've built. Your rustic charm and live and let live attitude don't belong here anymore. Use what time you have left wisely, Mr. Langston." And with that, she shut the door in my face. I didn't sleep that night. Every rustle outside made me sit up, convinced it was the next move in Miranda's relentless game. Around 3 a.m., my phone rang, and I nearly dropped it. The caller ID showed Betty Morrison, my neighbor from across the lake. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Sawyer," she said, "there was a woman at my door tonight. She was asking about an old map, the one your grandfather drew for me years ago." She seemed angry when I told her I didn't know anything about the map. My blood ran cold. Miranda was no longer content with targeting me. She was now interrogating my neighbors, digging for any fragment she could use as leverage. The escalation after Betty's call came fast and hit like a hammer. Miranda deployed what Tom Stevens grimly called the nuclear option, a formal request for a restraining order, accusing me of a pattern of harassment and threatening behavior. When the certified envelope arrived, it felt like a sentence, not a summons. The documents painted me as unstable, aggressive, and menacing. The so-called evidence included security footage of me checking my mailbox and watering plants, presented as threatening surveillance. I stood holding the papers, numb, as if I were 12 again, watching my family's fate decided by cold legal jargon and indifferent faces. My hands shook so badly, I had to drop the documents onto the table. The coffee mug slipped from my grip and shattered, shards and hot liquid spreading like a physical manifestation of the chaos unraveling around me. I couldn't move. I just stood there, paralyzed by the same helpless dread I'd felt as a child facing a system too vast and indifferent to fight. The 6 days leading up to the hearing passed in a fog of insomnia and mounting dread. I couldn't focus, couldn't eat, and started checking my locks compulsively. Every creak of wood or rustle of leaves outside sent my heart racing. Tom tried to reassure me, saying restraining orders based on flimsy evidence usually didn't stick, but his voice was a distant echo against the rising tide of panic. Rick kept his distance, clearly afraid of becoming Miranda's next target. Eugene's surveillance felt like a toy compared to her legal arsenal. Betty, understandably shaken, wanted nothing more to do with the situation. Miranda had tapped into a bottomless reservoir of resources. Every day brought a new setback. Surprise inspections, code violations, obscure complaints from local agencies. Fighting her felt like trying to battle a hydra cut off one head. 2 more appeared. By the night before the hearing, I was completely unraveling. I couldn't sleep, couldn't form thoughts in a straight line. I sat by the lake at 2 a.m., seriously considering walking away from everything my grandfather had built, just to escape this slow-motion disintegration. The hearing was a disaster from the moment I stepped into the courtroom. The quiet tension, the rigid formality. Miranda sitting composed beside her attorney while I fought to keep my hands from shaking. It was a perfect storm. When it was my turn to speak, I could barely get words out. My voice trembled so badly the judge asked me to repeat myself more than once. I sweated through my shirt despite the air-conditioned courtroom, and my notes might as well have been written in a foreign language. Miranda's attorney delivered a calm, confident case, painting me as a bitter, erratic loner lashing out at a successful neighbor. When my time came, all I could offer was stammered, incoherent answers that did more harm than good. Tom presented our evidence, but it was too late. The judge had already formed an opinion. A temporary restraining order was granted, pending a full hearing in 30 days. I was legally barred from coming within 100 feet of Miranda's property, meaning I couldn't check my mailbox, access parts of my own yard, or even sit on certain corners of my porch without risking arrest. Leaving that courtroom, I felt like something essential inside me had been scooped out and thrown away. Tom kept talking about appeals, due process, evidence, but all I heard was the silence of defeat. That night, I sat by the lake until the sky started to lighten, the water reflecting the first touches of dawn. I thought about my grandfather, his strength, his quiet certainty. He'd built a life out of nothing, raised 5 kids through hard times, and never once backed down when something mattered. What would he think of me now undone by a wealthy neighbor with a vendetta and a Rolodex of bureaucrats? As the sun broke the horizon, painting the lake in gold, I made a decision. I wasn't done, not yet. Before I gave up, I would go through every document my grandfather left behind. If there were answers buried in his papers, I would find them. I owed him that. I owed myself that. The basement had always been the one place I avoided. It was packed with decades of accumulated history boxes of ledgers, letters, and legal records that felt too heavy to face. But with 30 days ticking down and nothing left to lose, I spent the next morning hauling every box up to the main floor. The scale of it was overwhelming. Contracts from the 1940s, correspondence with local officials, land surveys, insurance records, meticulous documentation, stretching across 6 decades. At first, it all seemed routine. But deep in the 4th box, wrapped in a faded towel like a family heirloom, I found something that made my heart stop. A metal strongbox about the size of a thick book, with a rusted combination lock and a strip of masking tape across the top. On it, in my grandfather's unmistakable handwriting, "For Sawyer, when the time comes." I sat cross-legged on the living room floor, the box in my lap, surrounded by generations of paper. The combination lock was old-school 4 numbers. I tried his birthday. Nothing. Then I remembered something from his funeral. The pastor had said that the day my grandmother died was when he truly understood the meaning of love and loss. My fingers trembled as I entered the date of her death month, day, year. A soft click echoed in the still room. The lock gave way. Inside was a stack of documents that changed everything I thought I knew. The first was a deed from 1962, embossed with official seals, the kind of document that signaled serious transactions. My grandfather hadn't just bought the small plot where my cabin stood. He had acquired 52 acres of prime lakefront property. That included my cabin, the surrounding forest, long stretches of undeveloped shoreline, and this part made my vision blurred as 65% of the lake itself. The description was incredibly detailed, complete with hand-drawn maps, precise measurements, and outlined water rights that far exceeded anything in public records. According to this, Miranda's house, Rick's, and at least 7 other homes were all built on land that legally belonged to my family. The implications were staggering. I wasn't some fringe cabin dweller under siege. I was the rightful owner of most of the neighborhood. The developments around me had been built without regard to the original land rights. But the most valuable item in the box wasn't a legal document. It was a letter, written in my grandfather's careful script, dated just 2 months before he died. My dear Sawyer, it began. If you're reading this, someone is probably trying to take our land away from you, just like they tried when you were a child. Don't let them. This property has been in our family over 60 years. Every acre was bought and paid for fair and square. The documents in the box confirmed what the letter had claimed. We didn't just own the cabin, but most of the land around the lake where others had been building for years without permission. My grandfather's words continued with legal advice and contact information for attorneys, but what struck me most was the personal message. I know you've been afraid of legal fights ever since what happened when you were 12, he wrote. But this is different, Sawyer. This time we have the law on our side. We have the documents to prove it. And most importantly, you have the strength to see it through. Don't let fear keep you from protecting what's rightfully yours. You're stronger than you know. You have more friends than you realize. And sometimes, the people who look the most powerless turn out to be the most dangerous opponents when they're fighting for something that really matters. When I showed the contents to Tom Stevens, his reaction was one for the history books. He sat in stunned silence for nearly 5 minutes, examining each document with the kind of laser-focused scrutiny I'd only ever seen in courtrooms. Then, he began making calls, county records, title offices, legal contacts. When confirmations began trickling in, he laughed aloud, an uncharacteristically genuine sound. Sawyer, he said, spreading the documents across his conference table like a general laying out a battlefield map. This doesn't just change your situation, it changes the foundation of this entire neighborhood. You don't just own a cabin. You own the majority of developed land around this lake, including significant portions of several homes and yards. Within 72 hours, we had full verification. Every paper was legitimate, legally binding, and properly filed. The county clerk's office still had the original 1962 records of my grandfather's purchase. Rick Palmer's reaction, when I called, was a mix of disbelief, shame, and something close to gratitude. "I should have known," he muttered. "Your grandfather was the most honest man I ever met. What do you need me to do to make this right?" It was the first time since this ordeal began that I felt like someone genuinely understood what I was up against. But more importantly, I was no longer afraid, not of paperwork, not of government offices, not of the ghostly panic that had haunted me since childhood. I had truth, I had evidence. And finally, I had the courage my grandfather always believed was inside me. Miranda, oblivious to the shift in momentum, made her final and most catastrophic error. She organized a public spectacle, a so-called emergency community safety forum with printed invitations, a full sound system, and appeals to local media. The goal was clear: destroy my credibility and galvanize the community against me. It was set for Saturday evening at the community pavilion, under the guise of addressing urgent property violations and neighborhood security threats. Somehow, my quiet life in a lakeside cabin had become a crisis requiring immediate civic action. When Tom and I arrived, over 60 people were packed into the pavilion, many unfamiliar. Miranda had clearly cast a wide net, pulling in supporters from adjacent neighborhoods, HOA loyalists, and anyone with a clipboard or grievance. She opened the meeting with a theatrical presentation, strategically chosen photographs, distorted facts, and a narrative that made my cabin look like a derelict hazard rather than a lived-in home. Her expert witnesses included a brother-in-law from the Parks Department and a friend with vague construction credentials, neither of whom had any legal or regulatory authority. But their technical-sounding claims about structural hazards and environmental threats impressed the audience, most of whom lacked the background to question them. The crowd seemed to buy every word. People took notes, asked alarmed questions, and talked about legal remedies. I sat in the back, feeling that familiar storm of panic, public humiliation, social judgment, the kind of community scorn that had traumatized me as a child. My breath caught in my throat as Miranda built toward her crescendo, urging immediate action against me. And then Betty Morrison stood up. She moved slowly but with purpose, carrying a rolled-up document that looked older than most of the attendees. Her expression was resolute, as if she were about to steer the entire gathering off its current course. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Before anyone makes any decisions, I think you all need to see something that changes everything." She walked to the front and gently unrolled what turned out to be a meticulously hand-drawn map, its lines aged but clear. "Sawyer's grandfather gave this to me in 1985, she explained. "He was worried that someday people would build in the wrong places around the lake. So he made sure I understood exactly where the property boundaries were, based on his original land purchases." The map showed the lake and surrounding areas with precise measurements and boundary lines that included far more territory than anyone had realized. My family's property, it turned out, stretched well beyond the cabin site to encompass much of the developed neighborhood. The room fell into stunned silence. Miranda paled. Her voice wavered when she objected. "That's just an old sketch. It doesn't have any legal weight." But Tom was already on his feet, carrying the strongbox that had changed everything. "Actually," he said, calm and precise, "it carries full legal standing. It matches official county records dating back to 1962, one by one." He laid out the original deed, surveys, and legal documents, each supporting the map's validity. The evidence was irrefutable. My family had owned 52 acres of lakefront property for over 6 decades, including land beneath several homes. I stood, my heart pounding, but my voice was calm and firm. "I don't need to apologize for living peacefully on my own land," I said, meeting Miranda's eyes and then scanning the crowd. "But some of you may need to explain why your homes and landscaping are sitting on property my family has owned for 60 years. The room erupted into motion. People reached for phones, whispering urgently to spouses and dialing attorneys and real estate agents. Panic rippled through the crowd as the reality sank in. Property lines had been crossed, titles clouded, foundations laid on someone else's ground. Rick Palmer stood and issued a formal apology, admitting he'd been misled into supporting Miranda's campaign without understanding the real facts about property ownership. Even some of Miranda's out-of-town supporters quietly slipped away, realizing they'd been duped. But Miranda wasn't finished. As the meeting spiraled into confusion, with attendees demanding clarity about their own property rights, she rose with a face twisted in rage and desperation. "This isn't over, Langston," she snapped, her voice sharp enough to make people recoil. You think those old documents make you clever, but you have no idea what I'll do when someone threatens everything I've built, she stormed. Out of the pavilion, leaving behind her props and presentation materials, evidence of a carefully orchestrated campaign now in tatters. As the crowd dispersed, many stopped to apologize or ask questions about historical land claims. The local reporter, who'd been taking notes all along, requested a follow-up interview to dig deeper into the unfolding property dispute. For the first time in months, I felt like I was setting the course rather than reacting to Miranda's schemes. Still, her final words echoed ominously. She wasn't ready to lose, even with the law against her. Her final desperate move came at 3:30 a.m. on a Tuesday. Had Eugene Gable not been up with his usual insomnia, keeping watch from his bedroom window, Miranda might have succeeded in erasing the evidence of my property rights. I jolted awake to Eugene pounding on my door, shouting about trucks and demolition. Crews descending on my land under cover of night. Groggy and barefoot, I rushed outside and saw headlights and flashlights cutting through the darkness along the lakeside. The sound of heavy machinery echoed something was being set up fast. "They're going after your cabin," Eugene shouted, pointing toward a line of trucks that had somehow reached the far side of the property without disturbing anyone else. In the gloom, I spotted a compact excavator, several men carrying crowbars and sledgehammers, and a silhouette that looked unmistakably like Miranda, overseeing it all from what she likely thought was a safe distance. It was instantly clear this wasn't a county operation. This was a criminal attempt to destroy the physical proof I needed to defend my land. I called 911 while Eugene rang Tom Stevens. Within 20 minutes, the peaceful lakeside had turned into a flashing, chaotic scene. Patrol cars arrived first, flooding the area with red and blue lights. Tom showed up moments later, armed with legal files and a video camera to record the scene. The last to arrive was a clearly irritated county inspector named Williams, still half asleep, but quick to confirm the crew had no permits or legal authority to be on my property. The demolition team turned out to be day laborers, paid in cash, and completely unaware they were trespassing or participating in a felony. They'd been told they were part of an urgent county safety removal, a lie spun to make their actions seem official. As deputies began questioning them, it became clear they were pawns in Miranda's larger unraveling plan. But the real turning point came when Miranda herself was questioned and made a fatal mistake. She tried to justify her actions by claiming she had emergency authorization from county officials, when Inspector Williams firmly stated that no such authorization existed. Miranda doubled down, insisting she'd received verbal approval for an urgent safety response. That was the moment everything collapsed. Deputies called the county planning office's emergency contact, which triggered a chain of calls exposing an entire web of forged documents and internal corruption. Investigators discovered that Miranda had been paying a planning clerk to backdate approvals and fabricate complaint records. This scheme had gone on for years, with over $20,000 exchanged for falsified files that gave her cover to pursue her personal agenda. By sunrise, the whole conspiracy had come apart. Miranda was arrested on charges of criminal trespass, attempted property destruction, conspiracy to defraud, and bribery of a public official. The demolition workers were released after cooperating fully, though their equipment was seized as evidence. The corrupt clerk was also arrested, with investigators recovering boxes of doctored paperwork and cash payment records stretching back nearly 3 years. The local newspaper ran the story as front-page news under the headline, "HOA President Arrested in Elaborate Property Fraud Scheme." The article outlined how Miranda had rigged county systems and bullied property owners who didn't align with her vision of what the community should be. As the investigation widened, we learned I hadn't been her only target. 3 other families had been forced off their land using similar tactics. Legal consequences hit fast. Besides criminal charges, Miranda faced multiple civil suits from other victims. Within a week, her house was on the market as she scrambled to fund legal defense and pay restitution. The Lakeside Estates HOA was formally dissolved after a unanimous emergency vote from remaining members eager to escape the scandal's shadow. What happened next in our neighborhood was nothing short of a transformation. Rick Palmer was chosen to lead a new, entirely voluntary neighborhood group focused on environmental stewardship and cooperation, not control. Eugene Gable was officially named Neighborhood Watch Coordinator, a role he'd long informally played. Betty Morrison became our unofficial historian, guiding neighbors through the tangled history of their own property deeds. As for me, I went from being a target to a local hero and the legal owner of much more land than I'd ever realized. A final county survey confirmed that my grandfather's 1962 deed was fully valid and enforceable, granting me ownership of 52 acres of prime lakefront property. Several neighbors approached me to purchase small plots, resolving long-standing boundary confusion and offering me a level of financial comfort I'd never known. 8 months later, Tom Stevens called with the final outcome of Miranda's case. 18 months in jail, 3 years probation, and over $75,000 in court-ordered restitution. She'd sold her home and relocated to another state, likely seeking a place where no one knew her as a disgraced HOA president. "You know what the most satisfying part is?" Tom said. "Because of your case, the county has completely overhauled how HOAs get approval. What you went through probably saved dozens of families from similar abuse." As I hung up and watched the sun set over calm water, I remembered my grandfather's words about property rights, how some things are worth defending, no matter the cost. The lake was still again, but I now knew that real peace doesn't come from silence or retreat. It comes from standing up, from fighting when it matters most. From whispers to wreckage, HOA Simplified brings it all.